Hello, welcome to our latest video. Today's video I'm going to show a basic indicator. So this is really a back to basics, how to write a simple indicator. And the reason I'm releasing this video is that I find that as I write the more complex indicators, I'm constantly talking about the same basic features. So what I'm going to do is release this video which describes the basic features, and then in future videos I can just go ahead and look at the relevant aspects of those indicators without having to go over the basics each time, and I'll refer you back to here. This is also a good starter point for someone who might be just beginning to write their own code. So this is a basic indicator. It's quite simple. We'll be able to cover it easily. This is actually an ATR channel indicator, and over here in the navigator panel you can see I have Orchard, ATR Channel, ATR Channel. If I drag that onto the screen, you'll see this About page. There's the name of my indicator, ATR Channel version 1.00. You'll see those properties inside the code when we get to the code. And here's the copyright statement. And you see if I hover over that, it's actually a hyperlink to orchardforex.com. You'll also see how those are set up in the code. Some common information here. This is not part of the code, but allow DLL imports. Typically that's turned off. It's a security feature. It prevents indicators from calling DLLs. If you don't know where the indicator has come from, you don't want it calling DLLs at random because it could be releasing some kind of virus onto your system. There's an inputs page. You'll also see these inputs in the code. The ATR channel is a central moving average line, and around that is an upper and lower line that are separated from that by a multiple of the ATR. So I have three inputs here: the moving average bars, moving average method, and moving average applied price. They are to define that central moving average line. This is just an integer. If I double click that, you can see I can change that to any other integer that I like. The moving average method, there's a range of these. You can see that's a drop down. So I can choose simple, exponential, smoothed, or linear weighted. And the moving average applied price, again, if I double click, that's a drop down. There's the close, open, high, low, and so on. Applied prices. ATR bars. This is to calculate the value of the ATR, and I'm also defaulting that to 10. You'll see that in the code. And the ATR channel factor is the multiple of that ATR that the upper and lower lines are going to be separated from the central moving average line. The colors. So I have three lines on the screen. The middle line is going to be green. The upper line is white and the lower line is yellow. You can see here the width of the line. That middle line is thicker than the other two. That's so that it's easier to see on screen for the video. And the style. So this is a solid line and these two are dotted lines. And the visualization on all time frames showing the data window. The data window, which I'll open when we get the indicator on screen, actually shows the numeric values from the indicator. So I'll just say OK, and that's the default indicator on screen. Let me go to View and Data Window. So the data window here, and you see as I move the cursor around, it shows in this main upper and lower the actual values from that indicator for any bar that I'm hovering the cursor over. Now this is the default of 10 for the moving average. Let me change that. Go to the indicators list, ATR channel, edit, go back to the inputs, change the moving average bars. I'm going to make that 100 because it looks much better with a smoother line. And now you can see I have a much smoother line, but these upper and lower lines are still separated by three ATRs based on a 10 period ATR. So that's the indicator we're going to be creating, and you'll see how all of this is done in the code. Now to start, I have MetaTrader 4 open, and I'm going to open the editor. You can do that either from the toolbar here with this icon, or from the menu you can select Tools, MetaQuotes Language Editor, or you can just press F4. I usually use the toolbar here. Now with the editor open, we're writing an indicator today. I will always create my own indicators inside a folder separately from all of the indicators that are supplied with MetaTrader. I like to do that just in case there is a clash of name, and also it helps to keep things neat for me. So I've got a folder here called Orchard. It's always there. If you haven't got that, then you can create a folder. Just right click on indicators and select new folder, and then you can create your own folder. So if I go to Orchard, I will also typically create a new folder under here for each indicator that I'm writing, because I write quite a lot of things and I like to keep them separate, and as I have multiple versions of each indicator I can keep them inside their own folder. It just keeps them neat. You don't have to do that, but you'll see when I'm creating these videos that I will typically create a folder underneath that. So the indicator we're writing today as the example is an ATR channel. So right click there, select new folder, and I'll create the folder called ATR Channel. And now to create a file in here, I right click and I select new file. Because I'm already inside the indicators folder, the wizard expects that I'm creating a custom indicator, so I can just click next. I'm going to call my file ATR Channel. This copyright information is remembered from the last time you used the wizard, so if this is the first time, it will probably have the default MetaTrader information. You can change this to anything that you like. The parameters here will show up as inputs on your indicator, and I typically don't use this panel. I'll fill them all in the code, so I'm just going to skip that with next. For this particular indicator, all I need is on calculate, so I don't need to select the on timer or on chart event. So I'm just going to leave that selected as on calculate and next. And more properties here that I also don't use, and I'll fill those in the code. But indicator in separate window, there will be a line of code where I can indicate whether this is an indicator in the main window where the candlesticks show, or in a second window like a MACD. And these plots, there will be one for each individual item that I'm going to plot on the screen. So I'll just leave those empty for now because as I said, I'm going to put that in the code. And then finish. And when that finishes, we have the code on screen as created by the wizard. Close up this panel to save a bit of space. So the code always begins with some comments, a set of properties, copyright, the link and the version. They've all come from those panels that we filled in the wizard. Property strict is here because MetaTrader 4 went through a change some time ago, and to maintain compatibility with the earlier version code, they've introduced this property strict. Setting property strict will tell the editor when it's compiling the code to compile under the newer structure. You should always use that. And then this property indicator chart window, remember that box that I showed? This says that we are going to be creating our indicator inside the main window. The alternative, if you want a separate window, will be to use indicator separate window. I'm not going to try to cover both today. I'm just going to go with the main window, because to try to cover both in one video will become too confusing. As I see a need for it, I will create a second video where I show creating indicators in the second window. Now, because I didn't fill in any of the other properties, there is nothing here to define the indicators that are going to show, and there are no inputs. Let me just add some spaces so we can see what's going on. The OnInit function is going to be called the first time we load the indicator, and the onCalculate is called basically at every tick, every time something happens that might mean that you need to recalculate your indicator. And now, to make this easy, I've already written all of the code for this indicator. So what I'm going to do is erase all of this, paste my code in here, and then we'll step through that and I can explain each of the lines in the code. All right, you can see that I've already changed the format of the comments here. That should be an uppercase R, that was a bit of a typo. I still have property strict, copyright, link, and version, and they will all appear in that inputs panel. When you first load an indicator, there's the panel that showed that we saw in the demonstration, and it has the copyright message. If you click that, then you follow this link and it has the version number, and this is in the indicator chart window. Now, the indicator properties. From the demonstration, you would have seen that we had the middle line, the upper line, and the lower line. So that's 3. So I'm setting this hash property indicator buffers. That effectively tells the indicator how many pieces of information it's tracking. And then I need to define something about the visual properties of each of these indicator buffers. I don't have to define this information here. I can define it in code, but this does appear also on that first panel when you load an indicator. And if I don't fill this information in here, then some default information is shown on that, and it can get confusing for the end user if you don't use this and then change it later in code. So I like to actually set these values here. So the first indicator color, 1. So I've got 3 buffers, so you'll see that each of these sets of data is repeated with a number 1, 2, and 3 one for each of the 3 buffers. And I've got these arranged in alphabetical order: color, label, style, type, and width. The first one I'm coloring green, so it's going to be green on the screen. It has a label, which I'm calling main, and that appears in the data window that we saw. The style, this is solid, so it's going to be just a solid line, no dots, no dashes. And it's type draw line. There are several types. Draw line is the most common. It draws things like a moving average on the screen, where it's simply a line through the chart. But you can also have things like draw arrow, where it draws individual characters on the screen rather than a line, and draw histogram that will draw vertical lines. Now, indicator width, I'm setting this to 3 for that middle line because it's just a little bit easier to see on the video, but you might prefer to default that to 1. And then I repeat this for the upper line properties, but I'm coloring the upper line white, CLR white. I'm going to be calling that upper, and I'm drawing this as dots. So you see style dot instead of style solid. And I'm also saying draw line. So even though it's dots, it's a line of dots, which is different to setting this, for example, as draw arrow and then drawing individual dots at each point. And width 1. If the style is not solid, you can't have anything other than 1. So if I were to set this to width 2 or 3, then the style dot would be overridden and it would appear as a style solid. And then last, for the lower line, indicator color, and these are all numbered 3. I'm just coloring that line yellow. I'm calling it lower, which will appear in the data window. Style dot, draw line, and width 1. And now the inputs. The ATR channel, remember, it has a middle line that's a moving average, and then it has one line above and below that are separated by a multiple of the ATR. So that means that I need 2 internal indicator functions. I need to calculate the moving average, and I need to calculate the ATR. So for the moving average, there are 3 inputs to a moving average, and I'm setting those up with this input int, INP MA bars. My default is to use INP as the prefix to all of my input variables. So the moving average bars, I'm defaulting to 10. The statement effectively says I'm going to have an input on the screen. It's going to be of type integer. Internally, the variable is called INP MA bars. The default value on the input screen will be 10. And this, after that comment, this is a special case where the comments have meaning. This will actually appear as the prompt on that input on the screen. If I don't have this comment, then the prompt will just be the variable name, which is not very friendly. So I always create these comments after the inputs on the single line, and that appears as the prompt on the input. The next line, also an input, and here I'm using an enum MA method. So there are several enums built into the system. Enum MA method is one of them, and it effectively is a list of the ways of calculating moving averages. I'm calling this variable INP MA method, and I'm defaulting it to mode underscore SMA. So mode underscore SMA is one of the values for enum MA method. The benefit of using an enum here instead of a simple integer is that if you go to that input on screen and click it, you actually get a drop down that shows the various MA methods, where if I simply set this as an integer, you could enter any integer, even an invalid value. So using these enums creates those drop downs in the input screen. And still, a comment here at the end. Another input, enum applied price. This is the third input to a moving average. INP MA applied price, that's the name of the variable I'm going to be using. I'm defaulting that to price underscore close, which is one of the enum values for enum applied price, and then just the comment. Now ATR really only has one input, so I probably should have separated these lines. It's an integer input, and it's the number of bars for calculating the ATR. So just the same here as the input MA bars, this is input ATR bars, and I'm also defaulting that to 10. This last input isn't used to calculate the ATR, but this is the ATR factor. It's a simple multiplier that we're going to be using inside the code to multiply the size of the ATR to get the distance from this middle MA line to that upper and lower line. So it's not strictly part of calculating the ATR, but it is part of calculating the width of the channel. And I'm just defaulting that to 3. But here, note, this is input double, so you can actually enter fractions. You could enter 1.5. If I made this input int, then you would have to use integer values only. The next thing for an indicator data buffers. I have 3 buffers, remember, as I declared here, indicator buffers 3. For each of those, I need an array of values. These are declared as a double, and I typically call them buffer and then something. Now I have 3 lines. I have a main, upper, and lower line, so it's natural to call these buffer main, buffer upper, and buffer lower. And these are arrays. They are dynamic arrays. I haven't given them a size here because MetaTrader will resize these to be the size of the number of bars that are on the screen. And these effectively represent an array of the values of every element of that main line on the screen from bar number 0 up to the highest bar on screen. And the same for upper and lower. So these are going to be mapped directly by the code onto the values on screen. You can ignore this semicolon, that's only there to help with the formatting. The OnInit then, I have 3 arrays here and I have 3 buffers, but I actually need to associate each of these arrays with a buffer number. Just because they're in order here doesn't mean that that's the order that I want to apply them to buffers 1, 2, or 0, 1, and 2. So this is how I associate these arrays with one of the buffers. I'm using the setIndex buffer statement. Now mode main, mode upper, and mode lower are constants already defined in MetaTrader 4, but if you wanted to, you can replace these just with 0, 1, and 2. The buffers begin counting from 0. Now that may seem a little confusing given that here I called them 1, 2, and 3. That's just one of the little quirks of the language. When you're using numbers here in the property statements, then begin with number 1, but everywhere else begin counting at 0. So mode main is actually a constant built into MetaTrader 4 and it has a value of 0. Upper has a value of 1 and lower has a value of 2. And rather than just use 0, 1, and 2, I just find it more convenient to use names like this because later in the code, if I see those, I know what I'm talking about rather than seeing a number. So what these statements are doing, they're saying that I'm associating buffer main, this array, with buffer number 0 by mode main. And I'm associating buffer upper with number 1 and buffer lower with number 2. That's all I need in the OnInit section, and then I simply return init succeeded because this very simple indicator, there's no reason why I would not succeed with initialization. The onCalculate function then is called repeatedly by MetaTrader anytime something happens that might mean that the indicator needs to be recalculated. And there are a range of inputs to this. Rates total is the total number of bars that I have available, so number of bars in total. Prev calculated is actually the value that was returned from this function the last time it was called. You'll see this function returns an integer. And typically, you return rates total at the end of the function. And this is basically to say how many of the total rates you have already calculated so that you can avoid recalculating them. The first time this is called, of course, that is 0. So nothing has been previously calculated. But every subsequent call to this onCalculate function, prev calculated will be equal to the value you returned from this function the previous call. These elements, time, open, high, low, close, tick volume, volume, and spread, they are arrays of the values of the appropriate items in MetaTrader. So the start time for each bar, the open price, high price, low price, close price for each bar, tick volume, volume, and spread. And now I mentioned that prev calculated has the number returned from the last call to this, and you can use the difference between prev calculated and rates total to know how many bars you need to recalculate in this indicator so that you don't have to go back to the first bar every time and calculate everything. And this is the way I would typically calculate that. I declare an integer variable, I'm just calling it count, and that is equal to rates total minus prev calculated. So if I've calculated everything and this has been called again and no new bars are created, then count will be 0. But I want to make sure I recalculate the current bar because prices have moved since the last call here and maybe the value that I calculated for that bar should change. So I have this extra line, if prev calculated is greater than 0, count plus plus. So I'm just adding 1, just forcing that last bar to be recalculated. So that means that either bar number 0 is constantly being recalculated, which I want, or if rates total has increased by 1 because a new bar has formed, I not only want to recalculate bar number 0, which is the new bar, but I also want to do a final calculation on bar number 1, which is the bar that just closed, because it may have a different value to the previous call to this function. So at the end of this, I now have count, which is going to be just the minimum number of bars that I need to calculate. And now a loop. And as I said here, I'm counting down from left to right. You don't necessarily have to count from left to right. You can count from right to left if you like, but I just prefer to keep my loops consistent. Some indicators actually do need you to have calculated the value from previous bars before you can calculate the current bar, and so counting down is the best way to do that. And to count down, I'm using this I minus minus. So the statement here for int I equals count minus 1. So count is the total number of bars that I want to calculate, but the bars are indexed at 0. So I begin at count minus 1, while I is greater than or equal to 0, I minus minus to count down. So just as a quick example, let's say that I have previously calculated everything and I come in here and count at this point becomes 0. I have a prev calculated, so I do count plus plus. Now count is equal to 1. So I only want to calculate one bar, but that bar is bar number 0. So for int I equals 1 minus 1, which is 0, while I is greater than or equal to 0, which is true because I is 0, and I minus minus at the end of that. So I'm just calculating that bar number 0. Now the first thing I want to do is calculate that main buffer. And to do that, all I have to do is set a value in buffer main element number I. These buffers are automatically resized as new bars are added to the chart. And if you have a chart where your number of bars has actually exceeded the maximum bars on the chart and something is being dropped off, this is also resized to remove the elements that are taken away. So buffer main I will reference bar number I on the chart. And these bar numbers, 0 is the current bar. So the bar on the right hand side is 0. The bar to the left of that is 1. To the left of that is 2, and so on. So the highest numbered bar is actually the very first bar to the left of the chart. All I want to do here is assign the moving average to that buffer. And I do that with the IMA function. It's one of a whole series of indicator functions built into MetaTrader. The IMA function calculates a moving average, and the arguments to that are the symbol, which I get with symbol bracket bracket. That gives me the chart symbol, or the symbol on the currently open chart. Period bracket bracket then gives me the time frame on the current chart. The next argument for moving average is the number of bars, INP bars. And then there's a shift argument, which I never use. I've never found a need for it, so I always set that to 0. Then the method from the inputs, the input method, and the applied price. Now there's one more value to the side here, and that's I. So I want the moving average for bar number I using all of these inputs. And the reason I never use this shift, I can always get that same value by adjusting this argument. In this case, I don't need to adjust that argument at all, but there is no need to use shift and this index. I can always get the value there. So when I say I never use this, I actually do never use it. And if I want to get some kind of shifted value, I will adjust this. So those are the arguments to the IMA function. It returns a single value, a double, and that double goes into this buffer main element I. Next, I need to know the width of the channel. Remember, this is a channel that's based on a multiple of the ATR. So let's begin with the ATR function, and that's another inbuilt indicator, IATR. It also takes a symbol name and a time frame. So I'm still using the chart symbol and the chart time frame. The number of bars to calculate the ATR over, so that's from the input. And again, I want that for bar number I. And we also have this factor, so I'm just multiplying the ATR value from this function by that input ATR factor, and I put that into a variable called channel width. And then the upper line and the lower line are as simple as saying I'm using the midline, buffer main I, plus the channel width for the upper, and minus the channel width for the lower. So this loop will repeat then until I've processed all of the available bars. And then at the end of that, I return rates total, which remember will come back as the value of prev calculated in the next loop. And that is everything for an ATR channel. I'll just compile this. And I expected that to work because I pasted it in from work I'd done earlier. So that's the ATR channel done, and that will result in the indicator that I showed on screen at the beginning in the demonstration for this video. Now that covers all of the basics for a main screen chart, and it's also a reasonably useful indicator. There are of course many things that can make this more complex, and I'll be releasing further videos in this Back to Basics series as I find the need to introduce more concepts. If you found this useful, click like, click subscribe, and click the bell icon for notifications when we release new videos. Until next time, thank you for watching.